So today I want to introduce you to architecture as an overall field to help you start thinking about buildings as systems rather than just things that surround us every day. Now, you see buildings all the time. We spend all our time in buildings, most of the time in buildings, and you probably haven't thought that deeply in it. In fact, in the live class, I do an exercise where I ask people to draw the front of their house or apartment. And it's amazing without looking at any images or pictures. And it's amazing how much stuff people miss and they never realize it even though they see it every day. Our brains are really, really good at filtering out information we see all the time that we don't think is relevant. And part of being a good artist is switching that part off and starting to re-notice things that your brain has convinced you aren't important anymore. And so noticing these details is all about labeling it and understanding it as a system. And so that's what I want to talk about right now. Now, kind of considered the grandfather of architecture is a Roman architect named Vitruvius. Vitruvius, you might know from the Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, as it was called, and he was an architect. And one of the things that he did that was first to do was write about architecture, to try to categorize it. See, at that time, they didn't have the kind of computer science math that we did. They basically understood a pillar needs to be this tall and the pediment needs to be this wide or the building will collapse. They understood everything in proportions. He came up with 3 rules for buildings that they needed to have: firmitas, utilitas, and venustasis. So the first is firmitas, durability. This is an actual Roman bridge that is still in use today. In fact, there's a city or two that still uses original Roman aqueducts. They were that durable and that strong. They were very good at developing concrete, especially this type of quick-drying concrete that worked well underwater. And it's incredible that their roads are still used. Basically, firmitas is the most important of the 3. If a building isn't durable, it doesn't last. And if it doesn't last, it can't be useful. It can have all the other features that we want in a building, but if it can't stand up to the elements, it doesn't do much for us. The second of these is utilitas, obviously meaning utility. As I mentioned before, several places still use Roman aqueducts. They still have a utility and a purpose. The building needs to be sturdy, and then it needs to serve a distinct purpose. Most buildings serve the purpose of keeping us comfortable and keeping us from being exposed to elements. If any of you have ever done any cold weather camping or survival wilderness camping, you know that exposure is actually a really big problem for human beings. Something that maybe most of you who've lived your whole lives in, climate controlled environments have never had to deal with. So a building needs to have function. And the last of these, he said, is venustasis, or beauty. That a building should be durable, it should have a function, but beyond that, it needs another aesthetic function. It needs to be pleasant. We have to live in them, we have to look at them, and in fact, if you look out your window now, most of your view is dominated by buildings. And it's not just, oh, it's nice, we like to look at nice things. Psychology tells us that being surrounded by aesthetic beauty actually improves our mood, it improves our health, it improves our entire being. And so wellness is a part of creating into the buildings. So architecture is based on these 3 things. But architecture is also, in another way, many of us experience it more as like social media. In fact, architects more recently have really been thinking about creating buildings with specific vantage points for people to take selfies in front of. Think of the Eiffel Tower or the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which dominate this idea of photographing yourself with it. And in fact, some recent architects have really tried to figure out how to engage with this. Because architecture isn't just buildings that we live in. Architecture is actually a form of media. It's not just about something that we live in, it's a form of communication. Think of the words or friezes up on an ancient Greek building. These are to tell stories, and they were to tell stories at a time when most people weren't capable of reading or writing. So if you went somewhere to like a cathedral, you could see stained glass windows of the stories of the saints. You didn't have a way of really experiencing that otherwise because your the priest in your town spoke in Latin and the Bible was written in Latin. So you didn't know how those stories were. You didn't experience them except through the architecture of buildings. In fact, Victor Hugo's the Notre Dame de Paris, or as we know it, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, spends most of its time talking about architecture. At the time, the Notre Dame Cathedral that he wrote this book was in disarray and was going to be torn down because they saw it as an eyesore. hard to believe now, as it's a huge cultural landmark that they're spending tons of money to rebuild. His theory was that the novel, with people being able to read and write, destroyed the idea of architecture as our primary way of telling stories. And in fact, the Notre Dame Cathedral is infamous for having the entire lineage of the French kings etched in relief onto it. Architecture isn't just buildings, it is storytelling, just like most of the other art that we're going to do in this class. Little Notre Dame Cathedral, and we can see reliefs of kings and saints and all sorts of things in there because it's part of the story of the city. Architecture is about, in this dialogue, is about contrast, this versus that. And I want to just introduce to you for the rest of this video a couple of this versus that concepts, contrasts that architects think about and that you should be thinking about when you're developing your own buildings. What side of this argument are they on? Sort of modern versus ancient. So the first of these is symmetry versus asymmetry. We're always trying to achieve balance in our compositions. That is, the sides balance each other, and there's two basic ways of doing this. So on the left, this is actually two different images of two art museums, very famous ones. On the left is the Louvre, which is perfectly symmetrical. If you've ever been out to the Louvre in Paris, they have this incredible palace, and even when they added the new glass pyramid section, they kept it perfectly in alignment and symmetrical with the rest of the composition. Taj Mahal is symmetrical. In fact, most famous buildings have what we call bilateral symmetry down the center. This simulates the way humans have our own bilateral symmetry, so we're naturally predisposed to find them to be very appealing. On the other hand, we can also balance things with asymmetry, like Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim or St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Things that have balance to them, but aren't purely symmetric. Again, a lot of the buildings we're going to be working with in this class, we're going to stick with symmetry because it's easier to work with and start with. But as you're looking at buildings, notice how they try to balance, say, like entrances or windows, or where they're not balanced. The next I want to think about is proportion versus scale. So in a skyscraper, they're all equally skyscrapered out, and they're all equal relative size, and their windows are all of equal size. These equal sized windows mean we have an understanding of how tall the building is. A famous thing about Disneyland is they make their buildings look taller by each floor is shorter and smaller windows. So it actually looks like it stretches up higher and the buildings are more stories than they actually are. I'll talk about that in a later video. But there's also this sense of scale that denotes importance. So for instance, the Eiffel Tower was a huge controversy when it was first constructed in Paris because there was a law put down by the King of France that said Paris's buildings couldn't be more than 5 or 6 stories tall, which is why in Paris most of the roofs have these strong arches and the roof level is a whole separate floor because it was a way of cramming in extra space. And the Eiffel Tower, which is originally a radio tower constructed for their World's exhibition, was so much larger than its surrounding area. But this surrounding area denotes importance versus a skyscraper is just one of much taller buildings by itself. In fact, you can see modern Paris in the background is much more conventional skyscraper-wise compared to old Paris with its traditional Haussmann-style buildings, surrounded though in the middle by this large Art Deco iron wrought structure. So proportion versus scale, it's all relative to the space that it's in. I want to talk too about this concept of space versus section. The idea of having something completely open versus having something closed off. On the left, we have the original open concept office as it was designed for the, Frank Lloyd Wright, by the S.E. Johnson building in 1939. This is the top floor of the building, and they wanted something that felt open and light. And so there was this creation to create an open space. By the way, this is a great open office. Most of the time, open offices aren't nearly this well designed or thought out. On the right-hand side, however, we have the Action Office. This is Herman Miller, Michigan-based company, original design, which became the prototype for the cubicle, something that a lot of office workers decry, but it's an original iteration of the open Action Office. It was designed to give you sections and areas to be broken off to work in. So there's this conflict between, do we keep space completely open or do we section it off for different areas? Think about a house, an open floor plan versus many different rooms. They go in and out of trends, but they lead to different experiences inside of the space. Then we have the idea of repetition versus hierarchy. This is similar to proportion and scale. In fact, even though modern New York brownstone row houses are go for millions of dollars, and they're insanely expensive and owned by primarily the ultra wealthy. At the time, row houses were created to be perfectly equal, perfectly equality. They wanted to create entire streets where every building was the same size with the same windows to denote that no one person was more important than any other, as opposed to traditional building where the richest person in town would build the largest house. By complete contrast, hierarchy like Neuschwanstein, which I know I'm pronouncing wrong because I can't really get into it, it's a weird name. A famous sort of Austrian fairy tale castle has multiple levels, and it goes up and up and up to denote importance of the sort of grand hall and the primary tower, where height and detail and ornamentation hierarchy shows what is more important than someone else. So something designed for the pleasures of a king spending almost all of his country's fortune building more and more beautiful castles for himself, versus a series of largely municipal houses designed to make everyone equal in terms of how they can experience living in the city. And then we have this idea of mass versus density. On the left is a modern Southeast Asian, I can't recall what country this is. This might be Singapore, but it might be China. I don't have my notes on here exactly. Density. Where the solution to fitting thousands of people into a city is to have a lot of empty space and then build a very strong tower. So there's room for parks that everyone can share, as well as some open space around the building so it doesn't feel so claustrophobic. On the right is Barcelona, a city that has some incredible architecture that has a completely different solution to this problem, by instead breaking the city up into individual chunks where each individual block has their own little parks and shops, and some have schools in them, and they're all distributed very equally throughout the city, where they all share some of the resources and face in. So each of these little blocks almost feels like its own little town. And in fact, there's some bitter football rivalries where each of these little sections have their own soccer teams that compete and play with each other in Barcelona to try to create that feeling of a smaller community. Mass, centralizing everything into one spot; density, spreading it out and getting this overall even distribution of the same concept. Two solutions to the same problem. You can almost think about it like all of these buildings being stacked up to make a skyscraper. And then last of these, and maybe most famous, is the idea of form versus function. And here I've chosen two buildings on campus to represent that. Our art museum, the Broad Art Museum, and our football stadium. Two public buildings designed to exhibit specifically, but done in two different ways. The Broad Art Museum is not particularly practical in design, but its aesthetic beauty is more important. Its durability is also important. Fun fact about this one, they actually had to spend, I believe it was some $12 million redesigning the irrigation systems on it, because the original designer, Zaha Hadid, one of this era's greatest architects, she had done so many buildings for places like London and Dubai. When she was hired to design this one, the designers in the company didn't take into consideration that Michigan gets a ton of snow. And so it structurally wasn't prepared to handle, how do we get snow off the top of this building? So they actually had to pull stuff out and retrofit it. I always think that's a fun story, but it demonstrates, again, the firmitas importance of this building, even though the anastasis, its beauty, is probably the most crucial. It doesn't matter if this building isn't exactly even or doesn't use its space as efficiently as possible. It doesn't matter how many people you can fit in it. It is meant to exhibit beautiful works of art and to be a beautiful work of art itself. On the other hand of the spectrum, the stadium, although you might love it, isn't a particularly aesthetically pleasing building. It's primarily about utility, answering the question, how can we get as many people into one spot as possible to watch some people down in the field as much as they possibly can? And how can we give all of them the best view that we can give them in the same space? So everything faces inward, and all of the structure, the superstructure on the outside of the building, it doesn't matter if it looks good or not. They don't really worry that much about it. It's primarily just a scaffolding to keep everything else up. So these are just a couple of introductory ideas to how architecture works and how you should start thinking about it. And the more you start to see that there's this dialogue between the buildings around you, you're walking around shopping or just driving down the street, I want you to look and start observing what you notice about these sort of dialogues happening in architecture. I'll see you in the next one.